This is a chronological list of all those who served as British Prime Minister and were still living at different periods in history. There have been 4 periods when there was only one living Prime Minister, starting with the appointment, 1721, of Robert Walpole, and more recently during the second term of William Ewart Gladstone upon the death, 1881, of Benjamin Disraeli. There have been 11 periods when 6 living current or former Prime Ministers coexisted, with the longest being a 9-year period beginning with the first appointment, 1834, of Robert Peel. The most recent period is ongoing since July 2019, when Boris Johnson was appointed Prime Minister. His 5 living predecessors are John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, and Theresa May. There has been one period, 1754, with no living Prime Minister, a period of 10 days that spanned the death of Henry Pelham on March 6 and the appointment of the Duke of Newcastle.If one were to include future Prime Ministers. There was one period when 19 had coexisted, see statistics, below. There have been 4 men who have been the only living Prime Minister: Sir Robert Walpole, as the first, from April 1721 to February 1742, Henry Pelham, from Walpole's death in March 1745 to March 1754, the Duke of Newcastle, from Newcastle's appointment in March 1754 to November 1756, and William Ewart Gladstone, from Benjamin Disraeli's death in April 1881 to June 1885. During 11 periods in the history of Great Britain and the United Kingdom from 1801 to present, there have been 6 persons alive to have been Prime Minister. Such periods include, from October to November 1768, when Newcastle, Lord Bute, George Grenville, Lord Rockingham, Lord Chatham, and the Duke of Grafton were alive; from January to November 1770, when Bute, George Grenville, Rockingham, Chatham, Grafton, and Lord North were alive; from December 1783 to March 1792, when Bute, Grafton, North, Lord Shelburne, the Duke of Portland and William Pitt were alive; from December 1834 to February 1844, when Henry Addington, Lord Goderich, the Duke of Wellington, Lord Grey, Lord Melbourne, and Sir Robert Peel were alive; from May to October 1923, when Lord Rosebery, Arthur Balfour, H. Asquith, David Lloyd George, Bonnerlog, and Stanley Baldwin were alive; from January 1924 to February 1928, when Rosebery, Balfour, Asquith, Lloyd George, Baldwin, and Ramsay MacDonald were alive; from October 1964 to January 1965, when Winston Churchill, Clement Attlee, Sir Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, Sir Alec Douglas Home and Harold Wilson were alive; from April 1976 to January 1977, when Eden, Macmillan, Home, Wilson, Edward Heath, and James Callaghan were alive; from May 1979 to December 1986, when Macmillan, Home, Wilson, Heath, Callaghan, and Margaret Thatcher were alive; from November 1990 to May 1995, when Home, Wilson, Heath, Callaghan, Thatcher, and John Major were alive. The 11th and most recent period is ongoing since July 2019, when Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May and Boris Johnson are still alive. Of these periods, the earliest 2 and the most recent 3 consisted of each Prime Minister appointed consecutively. The longest period where there have been 6 living Prime Ministers was 9 years and 67 days, ending with the death of Addington in February 1844. There has been only one period where there has been no living Prime Minister, in March 1754 following Pelham's death on March 6 to Newcastle's appointment on March 16. Newcastle was the only person to be both the only living Prime Minister, from March 1754 to November 1756, and one of the 6 living Prime Ministers, from October to November 1768. There have been 22 premierships during which a Prime Minister has not died, the most recent being Theresa May's premiership. This does not include the premierships of Lord Wilmington, Rockingham, and George Canning, who were themselves the only Prime Ministers to die during their premierships, nor the premiership of incumbent Boris Johnson, as no Prime Minister has died since Thatcher, who died during David Cameron's premiership. Conversely, only twice, during the premierships of Pitt the Younger and Baldwin, has there been as many as 3 deaths during a premiership. This does not count Spencer Perceval's premiership, whose own death was the 3rd during his ministry. The longest streak of premierships without a prime ministerial death is 3, which has happened twice. No Prime Minister died during the premierships of Newcastle, the Duke of Devonshire or Bute, nor would a Prime Minister die during the premierships of Eden, Macmillan, or Douglas Home. If one were to include the multiple terms served by each Prime Minister that had been in office more than once, The record is 5. No Prime Minister died during Salisbury's first ministry, Gladstone's third ministry, Salisbury's second ministry, Gladstone's fourth ministry, or during the premiership of Rosebery. Because he was the first Prime Minister, and the fact that he served for more than 20 years, Walpole holds the distinction of serving over the longest period during which no Prime Ministers died. The second longest term without a death of a Prime Minister would be that of Lord Liverpool, who served almost 15 years in office. In recent years, the Prime Minister who served the longest without a death during his term was Macmillan, who served for almost 7 years in office. The longest period between deaths of Prime Ministers was the 17 years and 41 days between the deaths of Baldwin on December 14, 1947, and Churchill on January 24, 1965. The shortest was the 113 days between the deaths of Callaghan on March 26, 2005, and Heath on July 17, 2005. If the longest period between deaths is to be exceeded, no Prime Minister must die before May 19, 2030. The current oldest and second oldest surviving Prime Ministers, Major and Brown, would then be 87 and 79 years old respectively. The second longest was the 17 years and 30 days between the deaths of Disraeli on April 19, 1881, and Gladstone on May 19, 1898. Only 3 times, in 1792, 1995, and 2005, have there been 2 Prime Ministers dying in the same year. Following his premiership's end in 1804, Addington lived to see a record 14 premierships prior to his death in February 1844. Goderich follows with 12 premierships after his own premiership ended in 1828, prior to his death in January 1859. In modern times, the Prime Minister to have lived to see the most premierships following their own was Lloyd George, with 8 following the end of his premiership in 1922. If one includes future as well as past and current Prime Ministers, the record sits at 19. Between Disraeli's birth on December 21, 1804, and Shelburne's death on May 7, 1805, the following Prime Ministers were alive: Grafton, Shelburne, Portland, Pitt, Addington, Lord Grenville, Perceval, Liverpool, Canning, Goderich, Wellington, Grey, Melbourne, Peel, Lord John Russell, Lord Derby, Lord Aberdeen, Lord Palmerston, and Disraeli. Since April 6, 1955, a period of 65 years, 115 days, there have been at least 3 living Prime Ministers, and since June 23, 1885, a period of 135 years, 37 days, there have been at least 2 living Prime Ministers. References